The forest stretched out in every direction, an endless expanse of towering trees and shadows, their branches reaching like the fingers of forgotten giants. Ryan Parks, 55 years old, moved through it slowly, deliberately, his every step muffled by the thick undergrowth beneath his boots. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. It clung to him like the memories he couldn't shake, memories of a life that no longer fit him. The only sound was the rhythmic rhythm of his breath, drawn in deep, slow and labored, as though he was struggling to breathe in this world. He wasn't just walking through the woods. No, this was something more. Each step was a search, a quiet plea for something he could no longer name. His chest tightened as the emptiness that had settled in him years ago began to press closer, suffocating him. The silence of the forest felt less like peace and more like a void that mirrored his own. He thought he could escape the hollow, but the truth always came with him, even in the solitude. His gaze shifted across the expanse of trees, but his eyes did not see them. Not really. They were just the backdrop to his mind's endless churn. He had come to this place for reasons he hadn't yet figured out. Maybe it was to find some semblance of himself after losing so much. Maybe he was searching for something else entirely. The pain of his past gnawed at him, like a persistent ache he could never quite get rid of. He had been an engineer once, with a future planned out in blueprints and equations, but that life had crumbled in the wake of his wife's death. The illness had ravaged her quickly, leaving him alone with nothing but an empty home and empty days that stretched endlessly before him. The city had closed in on him after her funeral, its noise and its demands suffocating him, leaving him no choice but to leave it all behind and seek the solace of this vast wilderness. A soft rustle in the underbrush made him pause, his body tensing. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he could almost hear the pulse of his own heartbeat in the silence. But it was only the wind, only the trees standing tall, indifferent to his struggle. Ryan stopped walking, letting the quiet settle around him like a shroud. He was alone, deeply, profoundly alone. But there was something about this solitude, this vast, endless stretch of green, that held the possibility of something more, if only he could find it. His eyes moved across the forest again, searching for something, anything. And as the silence stretched on, it felt like the world itself was waiting for him to take the next step, to start something new. But what if there was nothing left to find? Ryan didn't know the answer, yet. As he moved forward again, his footfall soft in the undergrowth, the tension of his search lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved. The forest stretched endlessly before him, but it wasn't the forest that held his attention. It was something else, something only he could see, only he could find, and that journey had only just begun. The days had become indistinguishable. One bled into the other, a blurred passage of time that no longer held any meaning. Ryan had once been a man of purpose, a civil engineer with a mind trained to think in structures, in plans, in what came next. He had built things, bridges, roads, cities, and in doing so he had built a life that had been filled with promise, with routine, with love. But all of that had dissolved like sand slipping through his fingers. When she had fallen ill, everything had changed. The precise calculations, the certainty of the future, the feeling that everything was always moving forward, it had all crumbled. Cancer had taken her in less than a year, leaving Ryan to face a world that no longer made sense. His life had stopped, the engine of his days grinding to a halt, and all the plans, the hopes, the dreams they had shared turned to dust. Ryan couldn't bring himself to return to the city after her funeral. The house, now an empty shell, was too much to bear. Too many memories echoing in every room, every corner. Instead, he had retreated, like a man running from a storm, retreating into a quieter existence. A small apartment in the city, where no one knew him, where he could fade into the background of life, unnoticed and forgotten. It was safer that way, but there was no escaping it. There was no escaping the weight of loss that had settled on his chest like a rock, pressing down, suffocating him in the spaces between breaths. It wasn't just the loss of her, though that had broken him in ways words couldn't describe. It was the loss of himself, the man who had once walked with purpose, who had known where he was going, who had known that he mattered, now stumbled through the days without direction. He had found himself adrift in a city that no longer felt like home. The walls closed in around him, the noise of it all too loud, too real. And so the forest had called to him, the silence, the stillness, a place where perhaps he could find some peace, or at the very least escape the gnawing emptiness that followed him like a shadow. Each day in the woods was a small act of defiance against the quiet despair, but it was also a search for something more, for meaning, for a reason to keep moving. Ryan knew the answer wouldn't come easily, and yet it was all he had left, the hope that maybe, just maybe, in the solitude of the trees, he could find the man he had once been. But as the hours passed and the landscape unfolded around him, the question remained, sharp and unyielding in his mind. Would he ever find what he was looking for? The forest was quiet, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, a symphony of sounds that only the trees seemed to understand. Ryan walked deeper into the wilderness, his thoughts a blur of uncertainty, his body moving on instinct rather than intention. The weight of his solitude pressed in on him, but still he walked, driven by something he couldn't name. Maybe he was walking away from the man he had been, or maybe he was walking towards something new, something waiting for him. As he rounded a bend in the trail, something caught his eye, a flash of movement between the trees, quick, graceful, and then still. Ryan froze. His heart skipped a beat. He had seen it, no, felt it before he had even seen it, a presence, an energy in the air that made his breath catch. The wolf stood just beyond the clearing, its amber eyes glowing in the shadows. It was distant, not far enough to be lost in the thicket, but too far to touch. The wolf stood still, its gaze fixed on Ryan with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. There was no hostility in its eyes, but there was something else. A quiet knowing, something that seemed to see straight through him. For a long moment, neither moved. The wolf's presence filled the air, weighty and profound. Ryan's thoughts scattered, and he felt a strange, unexpected pull toward the animal, as though the very ground beneath him had shifted. He wondered, for a fleeting moment, if the wolf could feel his loneliness, his disconnection, the deep ache of loss that lived inside him. It was as though the wolf understood more of him than he did himself. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the wolf turned and melted into the shadows, moving with a fluidity that seemed to erase its presence in the blink of an eye. Ryan stood frozen, the silence ringing in his ears. He blinked, unsure if the encounter had been real or just some trick his mind had played on him in the isolation of the woods. Something stirred inside him, though, a spark of connection, an unspoken understanding. As much as he wanted to dismiss it, as much as he wanted to write it off as nothing more than the wild imaginings of a man far too long removed from human company, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling. Compelled by a strange, almost primal instinct, he followed the path the wolf had taken, his feet crunched against the dry leaves, his breath steady but shallow. He moved carefully, not wanting to disturb the quiet, not wanting to lose the moment too soon. The trees towered above him, their gnarled branches weaving together, forming an intricate canopy that let little light through. But he moved forward, each step bringing him closer to something unknown. But the further he went, the more the trail seemed to fade. The wolf's path was gone, the woods had swallowed it whole. Ryan paused, confusion tightening in his chest. How had he lost it? He had been sure, so sure, that he was following the right path. But now it felt as though the forest itself had conspired against him. A growing sense of disorientation settled over him. He was deeper into the woods than he had realized, the landmarks he'd passed earlier now long out of sight. His heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the growing realization that he was alone in a way that felt deeper than mere physical distance. He had followed the wolf. Perhaps he had followed it too far. The panic began to rise, but he forced himself to breathe, to center himself. There was no way back, not now. He would have to move forward, to trust that he could find his way, even if the path wasn't clear. He glanced behind him, but the world behind him had vanished into a thick, tangled web of trees. There was no going back, only forward. And somewhere, in the vast wilderness that stretched before him, the wolf, his silent companion, his unexpected guide, was out there, waiting. Ryan's steps were unsteady as he pushed deeper into the forest, the disorientation tightening its grip around his chest. His mind buzzed with the sense that he had wandered far beyond where he meant to go, yet something compelled him to keep moving forward. The woods were alive with the hum of nature, but he felt like an intruder, out of place, lost. And not just lost in the physical sense. Something deeper was unraveling inside him, a chasm of uncertainty he hadn't even known existed until now. The air felt thicker now, colder, as if the forest itself was closing in on him. He paused again, his breath coming in shallow bursts. It was so quiet, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Was it his imagination, or did the trees themselves lean closer, as if watching him? For a moment, Ryan was paralyzed, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite grasp. The encounter with the wolf lingered in his mind like a dream, fleeting and intangible. He could still see its eyes, amber and knowing, burning through him, as if it had seen something deep inside that he himself didn't understand. The wolf had looked at him like a mirror, reflecting something that made him uncomfortable. A reflection of the very thing he had been trying to avoid, his own sense of emptiness. He had come out here searching for something, hadn't he? Some sense of peace, or at least a distraction from the endless ache of loss. But what had he truly expected to find? He had wandered these woods with the belief that solitude might provide some kind of clarity, that by losing himself in the vastness, he might find a way to rebuild what had been broken. But now, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, he wondered if he had simply been running from himself. The isolation felt suffocating, and yet it was all he had known for years. The walls of his small apartment, the endless routines of his half-lived life in the city, he had buried himself in the familiar, even when it was no longer enough. He had been a man marked by the weight of loss, clinging to the remnants of a life that had slipped through his fingers. He hadn't realized how much he had locked away, how much he had buried beneath the surface, until the quiet of the wilderness had forced it all to the surface. What am I really searching for? The question echoed in his mind, unanswered and growing louder until it was all-consuming. He had followed the wolf's path out of some instinct, as if it might lead him to something, but now he couldn't help but wonder if it wasn't the wolf he was chasing. It was something else, something buried deep in him that he couldn't quite reach, some part of himself that had long since stopped speaking. His feet shuffled over the uneven ground, and with each step his doubt grew heavier. Was he running from something, or was he running toward something? His breath quickened as he stood motionless, staring at the thick shadows ahead. He was alone in the deepest part of the forest now, and the silence had become suffocating. The realization hit him like a cold wave. I am lost, he thought, not just in the woods, but in himself. The trail had disappeared. The world around him seemed to shift, the trees twisting and warping into shapes that mocked his uncertainty. Can I survive out here? The question crept into his mind, and for the first time since he had entered the forest, he felt the weight of true fear. Fear not just for his physical safety, but for the emotional collapse that seemed to be waiting just beneath the surface. The wilderness was testing him in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the wolves or the elements that would break him. It was the confrontation with the man he had become, and he wasn't sure he was strong enough to face it. Ryan turned in a slow circle, looking for any sign of a path, of anything familiar. But the forest gave him nothing. The world was vast, uncaring, and in its indifference he saw a mirror of his own life, the feeling of being adrift, untethered, with no clear direction. He had been running away from his pain for so long, hiding behind the daily grind of existence. But now, in the solitude of the wilderness, the truth could no longer be avoided. And yet, despite the fear, despite the overwhelming sense of being lost, something stirred within him, a small, fragile flicker of hope. It wasn't clear, wasn't bright, but it was there. He had made it this far, hadn't he? He had walked into the unknown, and though the road was dark and uncertain, he had survived. That at least meant something. But could he survive what he was truly up against? Could he survive facing himself? The forest was quiet, waiting. Ryan's body ached with exhaustion. His legs were stiff, his muscles protesting with every step he took. Yet the forest seemed endless, unyielding in its vastness. His mind felt as though it were unraveling at the edges, thoughts becoming jagged fragments that he couldn't quite piece together. The growing panic from his earlier disorientation had faded, replaced by a quiet resignation. This was his reality now, solitude in a place that seemed indifferent to his presence. He had no idea where he was, no idea where he was headed, and the uncertainty was a constant pressure on his chest. The path had all but disappeared, swallowed by the wilderness that seemed intent on erasing any trace of human existence. The trees were thicker now, their trunks gnarled and twisted, reaching toward the sky like silent sentinels. The air felt heavy, thick with the promise of rain that never seemed to come. But then a sound. A low, strained growl cut through the stillness, making Ryan freeze mid-step. He tensed, every muscle in his body going taut as his senses sharpened. The sound was faint at first, but unmistakable. Something was close, and then he saw it. Lying in a small clearing just ahead, partially hidden in the underbrush, was the wolf. But it wasn't the same confident, regal creature he had seen earlier. No, this one was different. Its once proud form was now slumped and vulnerable. It lay on the ground, its chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths, its fur matted with dirt and blood. Its leg was bent at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly broken, and a jagged wound marred its flank, the blood staining the ground beneath it. Ryan's heart thudded painfully in his chest as he approached cautiously, his breath catching in his throat. There was a moment, just a moment, where he hesitated. The wolf was a wild thing, and even wounded, it could still be dangerous. But the instinct to help, to do something, overcame him in that instant. Slowly, carefully, he knelt beside the animal. The wolf's amber eyes flickered open, locking onto his with that same piercing intensity he had seen before. This time, though, there was something different in them, a mixture of fear and trust, as if it were silently pleading for help. Ryan's throat tightened. It was clear that the wolf wasn't just a predator in this moment. It was a creature in need, in pain, and alone, much like him. His hands trembled as he reached for the wolf's injured leg, but the animal's sharp teeth flashed, and it growled low, a warning. Ryan recoiled for a split second, but the wolf didn't lunge at him, didn't strike. Instead, it just lay there, watching him with those deep, knowing eyes. Ryan's mind raced. What do I do? He could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him. Leave the wolf to its fate, or try to help. To save it would mean exposure, effort, maybe even risk. It could take everything he had left, but to walk away would be to do nothing. And in this place, in this moment, doing nothing seemed as dangerous as death itself. Without fully knowing what he was doing, Ryan reached out again, his hands more steady this time. He moved slowly, deliberately, and the wolf, as if sensing the change in him, did not resist. With great care, Ryan began to examine the animal's leg, trying to assess the injury, but it was clear that the bone was broken. He would have to stabilize it somehow. It wasn't easy. The wolf, though weak, still struggled, growling low under its breath as Ryan worked. But there was something in Ryan now, something he hadn't felt for a long time. The weight of the forest, of his solitude, seemed to lift slightly with each touch, with each attempt to help the animal. He was doing something. He was making a difference. For the first time, in what felt like an eternity, he wasn't just a man lost in the wilderness. He was a man with purpose again. Finally, after what felt like hours, Ryan managed to wrap a crude splint around the wolf's leg, using pieces of wood and vines he'd gathered along the way. His hands were covered in the animal's blood, his heart hammering in his chest from the effort. But the wolf was still breathing, still alive. The animal's gaze softened just a little. There was no longer fear in its eyes, only a silent understanding. And in that moment, something inside Ryan shifted. The walls he had built around his own heart, the ones that had kept him from feeling too much, from connecting with anything, with anyone, began to crack. This simple act of compassion, of caring for another living being, made him realize something he had buried deep for so long. He was still capable of caring. The forest, which had seemed so oppressive before, now felt less like a prison and more like a space for something new to grow, perhaps even within himself. And as he sat there beside the injured wolf, Ryan couldn't help but think, maybe I'm not as lost as I thought. The days that followed were a blur of quiet work, patience, and reflection. Ryan's life had been reduced to simple tasks, gathering food, fetching water, and tending to the wolf. In the midst of this, there was a calm that had settled over him, like the forest itself had wrapped him in a quiet embrace, urging him to slow down, to breathe, to listen. The wolf, though still weak, had begun to show signs of recovery. Its leg, now properly splinted, was healing. The animal's breathing had steadied, and though it was still cautious around Ryan, it no longer seemed afraid. There was a fragile bond forming between them, one that neither could deny. Ryan sat beside the wolf in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the forest floor. The light filtered through the trees in soft golden beams, bathing the two of them in a gentle glow. The wolf lay next to him, its body relaxed but alert. It was no longer the creature he had first encountered, the fierce, untouchable being that had slipped through the trees like a shadow. Now, it was vulnerable, not just in its body, but in its trust. It had let him help it, had allowed him to enter its world in a way he had never thought possible. Ryan spoke to the wolf in soft murmurs, his words unsteady at first, then more fluid as he spoke, as though the silence of the wilderness had opened something in him. He spoke of his life, of his past, of the woman he had loved and the pain he had carried ever since her death. He told the wolf things he hadn't told anyone, not even himself. He spoke of his fear, his confusion, his loneliness, and his desire to disappear, to become invisible in a world that no longer made sense. The wolf, of course, didn't understand the words, but it listened, and in its quiet presence, Ryan found a kind of solace. It was strange how a creature so different from him could provide a sense of understanding, a connection that seemed to transcend the barrier of language, of species. It was as if the wolf, by simply being there, offered Ryan a mirror of sorts. The more he cared for the animal, the more he found himself confronting the parts of himself he had hidden away, the parts that had been buried beneath grief and fear and uncertainty. The wolf, now moving with more confidence, began to follow Ryan as he worked. It would sit nearby while he gathered wood or searched for berries, its eyes never leaving him, always present. In a way, it was as if the wolf was teaching him how to be still, how to live in the moment without rushing toward some far-off destination. In return, Ryan found himself offering the wolf more than just care for its wounds. He fed it, protected it, and in the quiet hours of the evening, when the forest was wrapped in darkness and only the sounds of distant owls broke the stillness, he found himself talking to the wolf as though it were a companion, sharing his thoughts, his regrets, and his hopes. There was something healing about it, something profoundly human in the act of offering care and concern to another living being. It wasn't just the wolf that was healing. Ryan was healing too. though he didn't have the words for it yet. He had come into the wilderness seeking answers, seeking escape, but he was beginning to understand that the answer had never been about running away. It had been about coming face to face with his own vulnerability, his own need for connection. The wolf's trust had broken down the walls Ryan had so carefully constructed around his heart. And as he looked at the animal, watching its steady breath as it lay beside him, he realized something profound. I have been running from myself for so long, but here, in this moment, I am beginning to find who I really am. The forest had become a sanctuary, not just for the wolf, but for Ryan as well. And in that sanctuary, in the stillness between them, he was learning what it meant to truly be alive again. The days blurred together, the line between time and timelessness disappearing beneath the canopy of trees. Ryan's body had grown accustomed to the physicality of life in the wilderness, but the challenges continued to test him. Each day was an unrelenting battle of survival, gathering food, finding water, and making sure the wolf was healing properly. But it was more than the physical struggle. It was the weight of every moment, the realization that this vast, unfeeling world had no regard for his survival, except that which he carved out for himself. Ryan's hands were rough and calloused now, his body leaner than it had been before he entered the forest. Every muscle screamed for rest, and every inch of his skin itched with the bite of insects. His face was sunburned, his beard unruly, but beneath the weariness, beneath the grime and fatigue, there was a kind of clarity, a rawness. He had been stripped bare in the wilderness, not just physically but emotionally as well. The walls he had built, the defenses he had so carefully constructed over the years, were crumbling brick by brick. It was early morning when he felt it, the familiar ache of hunger in the pit of his stomach. He had grown used to it, but this morning the emptiness felt more pronounced. He glanced at the wolf, which lay curled at the base of a tree, its body still recovering. He would have to hunt again. The resources were dwindling, and the landscape felt increasingly hostile, as though the forest was testing him, pushing him to his limits. The hunger gnawed at him, sharp and insistent, but it wasn't just hunger that made his stomach twist. It was the exhaustion. His limbs were leaden with fatigue, and every step felt like it took more effort than the last. His body was reminding him this wasn't easy, this was no adventure, it was survival. He grabbed his makeshift spear, which had become an extension of his own body, and trudged off into the deeper part of the woods, the sounds of the forest filling his ears, a constant hum of life that seemed indifferent to his struggle. He moved carefully, aware of his every step, trying to avoid making unnecessary noise. Hours passed. Sweat stung his eyes and his legs began to tremble, but still he pressed on. The forest didn't give up its bounty easily. He had to work for every meal. And yet, despite the grueling effort, there was something strangely meditative about it. As he stalked his prey, he found a moment of stillness that had eluded him for so long. Moments where he didn't think of the past, of the life he had left behind, or of the pain he had carried for years. It was just him and the forest, and the wolf, somewhere in the distance, waiting for him to return. But despite his determination, the hunt was unsuccessful that day. The rabbit he had spotted earlier had darted off into the thicket before he could get close enough, and the other animals seemed to have disappeared. His stomach growled again, louder this time, the gnawing emptiness taking on a sharper edge. Ryan stopped for a moment, leaning against a tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The effort was taking its toll. A sharp, desperate pang of frustration surged through him. How much longer could he do this? How much longer could he continue this fight in the face of so much uncertainty? His body was betraying him, and with it, a creeping sense of doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Maybe the wilderness was too much. Maybe he wasn't meant for this kind of life. But then he thought of the wolf. Its eyes had followed him with such quiet trust, as if it knew something he didn't. He thought of the moments they had shared in the stillness of the forest, how it had allowed him to care for it, to break through the walls of his own heart. No, he couldn't give up. Not yet. With a deep breath, He stood up straight again, forcing the frustration aside. The wolf needed him, and somehow through this exhausting trial, he needed the wolf too. It wasn't just the hunger or the survival that was testing him. It was everything else. His willingness to push past the pain, to rise despite the fear, to keep moving even when there was no clear path. By late afternoon he had returned to camp, his body aching with the effort, his stomach still empty, but something inside him had shifted. He wasn't just surviving, he was learning how to endure. And that endurance, that quiet persistence, was something he hadn't known he had within him. As he sat beside the wolf, his hands trembling from the day's exertion, he realized that maybe, just maybe, this was what he had come here for. Not just survival, but the chance to confront himself, to see if he could withstand the weight of the wilderness and come out the other side. The wolf, as if sensing his thoughts, raised its head and nudged him with its nose, its body still weak, but its spirit unbroken. Ryan didn't speak. He just rested his hand on the wolf's back, feeling the warmth of its fur beneath his fingers. And in that moment, he understood. It wasn't about escaping. It wasn't about running away from the pain of his past. It was about facing it, about understanding that there was no easy way out. Survival wasn't just about food and shelter. It was about confronting what lay within. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan felt like he was beginning to understand how to survive within himself. The days grew longer, the evenings cooler, and the forest seemed to shift along with the changing light. Ryan's body had become stronger, more in tune with the rhythms of the wilderness. He could feel the pulse of the earth beneath his feet, the quiet hum of life all around him. He had become something more than the man who had wandered into these woods weeks ago. The wilderness had tested him, broken him, and then, in its own quiet way, it had begun to heal him. But now something new was happening, a subtle shift, a deep change that Ryan could feel in the air. The wolf had healed. Its leg had strengthened, the broken bone fusing together, its fur growing back fuller and thicker. It had become more agile, more confident. Ryan watched it now, as it stretched in the sun, its body lean and strong again. It no longer needed his care in the same way. It no longer relied on him as it once had. Ryan's connection to the animal had deepened in ways he hadn't expected. He had come to rely on the wolf's presence, its silent companionship, its watchful eyes. There was comfort in the quiet moments they shared, in the simple act of sitting side by side, listening to the forest together. The bond between them was real, but it was also something fragile, something that couldn't last forever. He had known, somewhere deep inside, that the day would come when the wolf would need to leave. It was a part of the wild, and the wild could never truly be tamed. The time would come when the wolf would have to return to its own life, to the vast freedom of the forest. Ryan didn't know exactly when it would happen, but he had begun to sense the signs. The wolf had started to wander further from camp, no longer waiting at his side with the same stillness. It would disappear into the trees for hours at a time, returning with no more than a glance before vanishing once more. And Ryan, in his quiet way, understood. The wolf was preparing to leave, to find its place in the world again. It was early one morning when Ryan woke to find the wolf gone. There was no trace of it, no sign that it had even been there. At first, his heart sank. An empty, hollow feeling spread through him as he scanned the forest, calling the wolf's name in a voice that sounded foreign to him, like it belonged to someone else. He waited, listening to the soft sounds of the wind through the trees, but there was no answer, no movement. And then, as he sat there, his heart heavy with the loss, he heard a sound, a soft rustle in the underbrush. He looked up and saw the wolf standing at the edge of the clearing watching him, its amber eyes locked onto his, and for a long moment there was nothing but silence between them. The wolf took a step back, then another, its body poised, ready to disappear into the depths of the forest. Ryan stood slowly, his breath caught in his chest. He felt an overwhelming wave of emotion, grief, yes, but something else too. It was a recognition. a quiet understanding that the time had come for the wolf to be free. Just as he had freed it from its injuries, so too must he let it go, to roam once more, to live in the way it was meant to live. He walked toward the wolf, each step slow and deliberate, and when he reached it, he crouched down. He placed a hand on its head, feeling the warmth of its fur, the steady beat of its pulse beneath his fingers. "Go," Ryan whispered, the word catching in his throat. "It's time." The wolf stared at him for a moment longer, and in its gaze, Ryan saw everything he had learned during this journey, about survival, about loss, and about letting go. The wolf had given him something invaluable, a mirror of his own struggle, a reflection of the parts of himself he had been avoiding. And now it was time for both of them to move on. With a final, quiet nod, the wolf turned and melted into the forest, disappearing among the trees as silently as it had come. Ryan stood there for a long while, watching the place where it had vanished, his heart heavy but strangely light at the same time. He was alone again, but this time the emptiness felt different. It was not a hollow ache, but a space for something new. The wilderness had given him something priceless. It had taken away his grief, his anger, and his fear piece by piece, until he was left with a clearer, quieter version of himself. And now, with the wolf gone, he could feel that something was shifting inside him. He had been changed by this journey, irrevocably, and he understood in a way he hadn't before that he too was capable of returning to the wild, to the freedom that came from accepting the past, from embracing the pain, and from letting go when the time was right. As the sun began to rise higher in the sky, casting warm, golden light across the forest floor, Ryan felt a strange sense of peace. The wolf had gone, but it had left him with a gift, the gift of freedom, the gift of release. He smiled softly to himself, taking a deep breath of the cool morning air. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly free. The days that followed the wolf's departure were quiet, and the solitude, once a heavy burden, now felt like a friend. Ryan wandered the forest, not with the aim of survival, but with the purpose of simply being. There was something profound in that shift, in the understanding that life could be more than just a series of battles against time, against nature, or against the past. It could be a journey of acceptance, of learning to live with what had been and what could still be. The wilderness had become a sanctuary in ways he hadn't anticipated. It had offered him something precious: space. Space to reflect, space to breathe, space to grieve. For years, his life had been defined by his work as a civil engineer, a career that had given him structure and a sense of purpose, but it had also trapped him in a world of deadlines and expectations. He had built things, bridges, roads, buildings, but in the end it had been his own heart that had crumbled, the structure of his life shattering when his wife Emily had passed. The grief had come like a flood, sweeping away everything he knew, leaving him adrift. There had been days when it felt as though his whole life had been consumed by that one loss, as though nothing else could fill the void. It was easy to fall into that abyss, to let it swallow him whole. It was easier to shut down, to keep moving forward as though nothing had changed, as though the weight of the pain wasn't there. But in the forest, Ryan had found something different. The forest had no expectations. It had no past or future, no judgments, only the present. And in that present, Ryan began to let go of the man he had been, the man defined by loss, by grief, by a life of plans that had unraveled. The silence in the forest spoke to him in a way words never had, and it was in that silence that Ryan finally began to listen to himself. He started to understand that his identity didn't have to be tied to what he had lost. He wasn't just a widower. He wasn't just a man who had been abandoned by his own future. He could be something new. He could be someone who had learned to live with the pain, who had learned to forgive himself for the mistakes and regrets that had weighed on him for so long. It wasn't an easy lesson. The memories of Emily still lingered in the quiet moments. the spaces between thoughts where she had once lived. He could still hear her laugh, still feel the warmth of her touch. But now, there was no bitterness, no anger, just love. A love that was no longer tethered to a past that could never be changed. It was a love that, like the wolf, could be set free. Ryan stopped at the edge of the forest one afternoon, staring at the path that led back toward the city. It was the same path he had wandered down when he first arrived, seeking something, searching for answers. But now the path felt different, less like an escape and more like the beginning of something new. The city had never felt like home, not since Emily's death. But now, as he stood at the threshold of the forest, he realized that the journey he had taken here wasn't just about running away. It had been about rediscovering himself. He had found the man he had been before the pain, before the loss. He had found the part of himself that was capable of living again. He knew the forest had given him what he needed, but it was time to move forward. Time to return to the world, to face the life that had once been too painful to bear. He wasn't sure what awaited him beyond the trees, but he knew that he could face it. He could walk through the world again, not as the man who had lost everything, but as someone who had learned that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about embracing the pain, learning from it, and moving forward. The journey had never been just about the forest or the wolf or the physical struggle to survive. It had been about the emotional survival, about finding peace with the past, and about learning how to live with the present. With a final, quiet glance at the trees behind him, Ryan stepped forward. The world was waiting for him, and this time he was ready. Ryan walked back into the city as though he were stepping into another world, a world that no longer felt quite so foreign, but still vastly different from the quiet rhythms of the forest. The streets were bustling, filled with the noise of traffic and voices, human voices, loud and eager, as though the world was in constant motion. People moved with a sense of purpose, their lives unfolding at a pace that felt almost overwhelming after weeks of stillness. But Ryan wasn't the same man who had left. He moved through the crowds with a quiet sense of confidence, his gaze steady, his steps deliberate. The world around him hadn't changed, but he had. The city had always felt like a cage to him, a place where expectations were heavy and unyielding. But now, as he passed through the familiar streets, he didn't feel the weight of it all. He didn't feel the need to prove anything or rush towards something that didn't exist. He simply moved, breathing deeply, taking in the sights, the sounds, and the energy of the world. He hadn't realized how much of his life had been spent running from grief, from fear, from the idea of living without Emily, without purpose. He had thought that surviving was enough, but the forest had taught him something more. Survival was only the first step. Living was the real challenge. As he passed a familiar cafe, he noticed the old woman behind the counter, the same woman who had always smiled at him when he came in, though they'd never spoken much. She looked up from her work and smiled when she saw him. Ryan smiled back, a quiet, genuine smile. It was the first time he had allowed himself to truly connect with someone here, without the weight of past grief clouding the interaction. "Good to see you again, Ryan," she said warmly. Ryan nodded, his throat tight for a moment, but he swallowed the lump. "Good to be back," he said, his voice steady, but there was a softness to it now, a softness that hadn't been there before. He continued on, finding a bench in the park where he had often sat, staring off into the distance, lost in his thoughts. But today, as he sat there, the world didn't seem as distant. He could hear the children laughing, the sound of a dog barking in the distance, the hum of life around him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a connection to it all, the city, the people, the life that pulsed just beneath the surface. It wasn't something to escape anymore. It was something to be a part of. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the familiar sound pulling him back to reality. He pulled it out, seeing a message from his old friend, Mark. "You free for coffee? Been too long. Let's catch up." Ryan stared at the message for a moment, feeling a wave of unfamiliarity wash over him. He had been so used to his own isolation, his own quiet existence, that the idea of reconnecting with the outside world, with people, felt strange. But then he realized something. He wasn't afraid of it anymore. He wasn't running. He tapped out a quick reply. "Sure, I'd like that." The idea of reconnecting didn't scare him. It felt like the next step, something natural, something right. He didn't need to stay lost in the wilderness forever. He had found something out there, but he wasn't meant to live in the past. He was meant to live in the world, to be a part of it again, to embrace whatever came next with the same quiet strength he had found in himself. The sky above was turning a soft shade of blue, the sun dipping low in the horizon as the city began to quiet. Ryan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the cool evening air fill his lungs. The wolf was far away now, gone back into the wild, and Ryan knew that he too had to return to his own life, but he didn't feel the weight of it. He didn't feel the need to rush. He simply felt free. The past was still there, yes. The memories, the grief, the pain, they would always be a part of him, but he had learned to carry them with him, not as burdens, but as the markers of his journey. They were not who he was. He was someone who had faced his darkness and had come out the other side. Ryan stood up, stretching his tired limbs, and glanced once more at the city around him. There was a world waiting for him, one he was ready to embrace. He took a deep breath and smiled. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan Parks felt at peace.